You may never have heard of the Safety Patrol. I'm not sure safety patrols still exist, but 55 years ago, being on the Safety Patrol was just about the coolest thing that could happen to an elementary school-age boy. And yes, in the sexist era in which I grew up, only boys were eligible. Safety boys, as we were called, got up 30 minutes early to make it to their assigned intersection before other children began the walk to school. Rain or shine, safety boys were at their assigned street corners, sometimes before the sun had even risen. There you stood, wearing your bright orange plastic belt and sash, encircling your waist, crisscrossing your chest, and looping over your right shoulder. This bright orange belt signified that you had the authority to tell kids when to halt their march to school, how long they needed to wait for traffic to clear, and when it was safe to proceed on their way. In return for this selfless service to your fellow students, you were rewarded with all manner of special privileges. You got to come to your first class late, as it was understood that your duties required you to wait for the last kid to make it safely into school. At the end of the day, you were dismissed early so you could get to your intersection before the hordes of children came bursting out to make their way home. You were entrusted with the most sacred duty of leaving school at any time of the day if a sick child needed an escort home. On the coldest winter days, after staffing your corner for 30 to 45 minutes, you got to warm up with a hot cup of cocoa. Rich, thick, creamy, chocolatey, and oh, so good. And you got to wear that bright orange safety belt all day long. But in my estimation, the greatest privilege of all granted to you as a safety boy was the gift of trust. Being a safety boy meant that adults trusted you, and that was the most rewarding thing of all, the privilege of being trusted. Now, this being America, 55 years ago, the only model for a safety patrol must, of course, be the military. That means we had officers. I rose through the ranks to the position of lieutenant. As a lieutenant, not only did I have a safety belt, I also got a silver badge indicating that I was an officer of the patrol. Being lieutenant meant I kept all the same privileges, but no longer had responsibility for a single intersection. Instead, I was responsible for an entire pathway to school. My job was to travel that path every morning and afternoon to make sure all intersections were covered. If a safety boy was going to be absent, he had to let me know so I could arrange coverage, or if necessary, cover the corner myself. The only thing better than being a lieutenant was being captain of the Safety Patrol. There were 4 or 5 lieutenants at any one time, each responsible for their own pathways to school, but there was only one captain. Lieutenants still wore orange safety belts, but a captain was too cool for a belt. As captain, I only needed a badge because, well, frankly, everyone already knew who I was. As captain, I was the BBOP, the bebop, the big boy on the playground. I didn't have a single pathway that I was responsible for. I had the entire neighborhood. I wandered through all paths to school, showing up unexpectedly to do a random inspection. Were all corners covered? Did all safety boys have on their belts? Were those belts clean? Were the lieutenants doing their jobs and making sure their respective pathways were safely staffed by the troops? Oh, the power. Oh, the authority. Oh, the trust placed in me, whether deserved or not. There was one particularly problematic corner. The corner of Linwood and Grove Streets was infamous. As it was a major thoroughfare, cars flowed down Linwood in an almost unending stream. and they flowed fast. There was no such thing as a school zone. The speed limit was a dangerous 45 miles per hour, the only corner on the way to school where cars traveled that fast. With no stop sign, no traffic light, and no adult supervision, this being a black neighborhood in inner-city Detroit of 55 years ago, the corner of Linwood and Grove was a tragedy waiting to happen. Now here's where I must pause because I know what you're thinking. I can almost hear the breath catch in your throats. So I pause to reassure you that while a tragedy could have happened on the day I am describing, it did not. Instead, what happened was a miracle. There were no safety patrol boys at Linwood and Grove that morning. Despite 3 being assigned to that dangerous corner, not a single one showed up. So when I passed by on my random inspection and saw the corner uncovered, it was my job and my duty as captain to take over. And I did. As I said before, captains have no belt, only a badge. So my authority was not as visible as it should have been, but I did my best. Arms stretched as far out as they could go, I held back the children who desperately wanted to get across that busy street. Now, there's one other thing that is problematic about the corner of Linwood and Grove. It is the last corner that must be crossed. The school sits right there, its beckoning doors wide open. The children can hear the school bells, the first one ringing to announce that school is open. The second bell ringing 15 minutes later is a warning that there is only 5 minutes left to get inside before you are officially tardy and must go see the principal. The kids I was holding back heard that second bell and they grew anxious. They knew what was coming. The traffic was especially bad that morning. Not a break in its flow appeared in either direction. The growing crowd of children began to chant. They were chanting at me to say, "Walk," the one word that would release them to race across the street before the tardy bell rang. Over the next 5 minutes, the crowd of children grew to stretch back down the street. The sound of their chanting, now in unison, for me to say walk was loud, but not as loud as that tardy bell. When it rang, my heart sank and the chanting seemed deafening. Now, when I say the crowd of elementary school children stretched back down the street, I should remind you that I too was part of that crowd. Though I was captain of the safety patrol, I was still an elementary school child. Though I was a big boy on the playground, it was still a playground, and I was still a boy. Responsible for them though I was, the children were my peers, and so I became annoyed with the chanting. One little girl in particular managed to get right next to me and scream over and over in a voice that was like fingernails on the chalkboard, "Say walk," as if I possessed magic, as if I was Moses and could part the Red Sea of traffic with a mere incantation. Now, I'm not proud of what I did next. In fact, it appalls me to this day. I should have known better. But at that childish moment, I did not. Gathering as much sarcasm as I could, for I did know what sarcasm was, gathering all the sarcasm I possessed into my voice, I looked down at that little girl and said what she had been screaming to hear. I said, "Walk." Now, I pause again to reassure you because I believe I hear the breath catch in your throats a second time. I pause again to say a tragedy did not happen that day. Instead, it was a miracle. So please breathe again. The little girl stepped around my still outstretched arms to stand in front rather than behind me. She took a hesitant step into the street. She looked both ways. Surely, I thought, she must see the unbroken flow of cars coming from both directions. Surely she must have heard the sarcasm in my voice, but she did not. Incongruously, unbelievably, she dashed forward into the speeding traffic, accompanied only by the screeching sound of suddenly braking cars. The world seemed to stop. There no longer was a continuous flow of traffic. All cars were at a standstill. There was no chanting. There were no school bells. There was only silence and stillness. With nothing moving other than my own beating heart, I looked around for the little girl and saw her underneath one of the now motionless cars. She lay there, but only for a moment. In the next instant, she was crawling out from under the car. Then she was standing, and though she looked dazed, next she was walking back to the corner. She was stepping up onto the curb and walking around my still outstretched arms, now frozen in place. She stood again safely behind me, the captain of the safety patrol. There was not a scratch on her. Rational, religious naturalist that I am, I don't want to believe in miracles. But what happened to that little girl that day? And what happened to me that night? Now, you can excuse my behavior any way you want. You can say I was only a child. You can say I should never have had that level of responsibility. What were the adults who created the safety patrol thinking? You can point out the systemic racism that leaves a dangerous corner in a black neighborhood without a traffic light or a stop sign. You can say all this, but none of that will take away the guilt and the shame that gripped me from that moment of that morning and would not let me go. If I could have simply disappeared, if I could have been swallowed up by the earth, never to be seen or heard from again, I would have chosen it gladly. I have very little memory of what happened the remainder of that day until I was alone with my guilt that evening. Acting on some seeming biological instinct, acting out of some spiritual necessity, I filled my bathtub that evening with hot water almost to the point of overflowing. I submerged myself with nothing but nose and mouth breaking the warm surface. I lay in the steaming tub a good 30 minutes, imagining every horrible thing I was feeling leaching out through my pores to be dissolved in the waiting water. As the water grew tepid, I let it begin to drain. I willed that my guilt, my shame, and more importantly, my irresponsibility, I willed all that to drain away with the water. Child though I was, I created ritual. And that was my miracle. And nothing really changed that day. The little girl, amazingly, really was okay. The adults did not blame me for what happened, though I blamed myself. I didn't lose my position as captain of the safety patrol, though I should have. Worst of all, the corner didn't get a traffic light, and the responsibilities entrusted to mere children were no different the next day. The adults seemed to have learned nothing from that horrible and that miraculous day. But I learned. I learned the consequences of irresponsibility, consequences I was determined to never face again. I also learned the importance of ritual, and both lessons continue to work miracles in my rational, religious naturalist life. I create ritual for myself, for my family, sometimes for my congregation. I've come to believe that ritual is as necessary to human existence as food and water. Human beings are ritual makers. I've come to believe that ritual is as necessary to psychological health as is love. of the many cruelties of Black enslavement, count among them the deprivation of our native rituals. Ancestral ritual was discouraged, indeed it was forbidden, lest its reemergence inspire us to our freedom. But so vital was ritual to our psychological survival that we would risk life and limb to steal away in darkness to the hush harbor, where we would find release in music, in dance, in chanting, and in ritual. Though those who would in vain attempt to be our masters recognize neither our marriages nor our rights to our children, still we ceremoniously wed, and still we religiously baptized, and still we believed in the power of ritual. Unitarian Universalists are not always comfortable with ritual. In my very first visit to UUCA many decades ago, as members of the congregation left service, I was startled to hear the distress they voiced over the lighting of a candle in Sunday worship. Rather than lighting the way to reason, a stray candle could spark the flame of emotion, of passion. And back then, a largely humanist congregation couldn't have that. I'm glad that much has changed in the ensuing years. We have our cherished rituals now. We light our chalice. We embrace meditation. We pray with our bodies in motion. We rediscover the passion of the human spirit that must never be torn out of our religion. For without it, religion becomes a dry and uninspiring deathbed from which no one arises. And our rituals must be new, alive, vital, and evolving. A living tradition must have a living ritual, and a diverse faith must have a multicultural praxis that rejuvenates. To that end, Skinner House, our denominational publisher, has invited Reverend Teague, Ayanna Stringer, and myself to co-author a book of contemporary ritual that reflects the heritage of African American UUs. To be published next year, this will not be a book just for African Americans. It will be a book for us all. It will, if we are successful, weave new threads into the broad cloth of our collective faith garment. The rituals that are a part of this service are a sampling of what we are creating. We welcome your feedback. We welcome your ideas. And we are grateful for the religious communities we serve that give us the opportunity to test these rituals in a welcoming space of worship. We close with a final ritual, a scaled-down version of my spontaneous childhood release of guilt into water, as I sought a rejuvenation and a renaissance.